Today I'm going to explain information processing and generalized motor program theory under schema theory using bench pressing as the main example. I think these fit together because information processing explains how the performer takes in, filters, stores, and retrieves the information, while schema theory explains how movement pattern itself is organized and adapted across similar tasks. You can't have generalized motor programs without information processing. For this, I'm going to go into two related motor skills, that being the flat bench press and the incline press. I chose those because they're clearly different skills, but they're close enough to show how one broad pressing pattern can be adjusted to fit different conditions rather than relearning from scratch each time. Across both variations, the main muscles are still primarily the pectoralis major, anterior deltoid, and triceps brachii, even though the exact contribution shifts depending on the angle and implementation, which is quoted or cited or supported by Luczak et al. 2013 and Rodriguez Rideo et al. 2020. The incline movement uses more the clavicle head of the incline press, but the general movement pattern is still the same across a flat, down, up, into an incline, down, up, dependent on bench angle. 15 to 30% bench angle is going to use more of that pectoral majors, and especially the clavicular region, as opposed to like a 45 and above angle, which ends up recruiting a lot more from the anterior deltoid, and even a little bit, if you're doing a wider grip and holding it steady, a little bit of that anterior deltoid. From the information processing lens or side of the issue, the first main issue is skill display. That is the information available in the environment. In a bench press, that includes the rack, the bar, hand placement, body position, bar path, coach cues, and outside distractions such as like music at the gym. The learner cannot process all that equally, and especially can't process it equally well at once because attentional control is limited, and working memory depends on attention to keep the relevant information available for use. That's supported by Cohen 2014 and over 2019. These people have the worst names possible for being used for sources. But essentially what that means is if you are trying to do a new skill, you're in the cognitive stage, feedback is useful, but only to the point that you can use that information. Your working memory is especially limited as opposed to more long-term memory, which has a lot more capacity, feasibly infinite capacity due to that capacity or capability to disregard and information and memory that is not pertinent, hence why we forget things to begin with. But that is where filter problems show up early on, as beginners often do not know what matters most. Instead of focusing on the useful cues like grip position, upper back tightness, the scent control, which is the eccentric control, the bar path, they focus on the wrong things, like how heavy the weight feels, if their back position feels awkward. They're trying to consciously control every small body part at once instead of letting the movement be a general movement program. When that happens, performance gets inefficient because the issue is not just physical, it's attentional and cognitive. That cognitive control has a lot less capacity than at times our physical capabilities. It doesn't help either that internal focuses diminish performance, especially in beginners, because they're focusing on, that really hurts my chest, it's my right shoulder feels weak. They're focusing on the pain of the movement rather than the outcome of the movement. So with bar path, you want to focus on a down, straight into the position you want, up into the position you want. When you start faltering and doing a row, which a lot of beginners do, you end up developing a lot of issues, and it will hamper schemas, because with an incline movement, which is very similar, you can't row it as efficiently. And if you do, again, that becomes a shoulder workout because you're doing an isometric hold and you're bringing it up and you're bringing it down. I did that in inverse, but you're moving it around using muscles that aren't in the chest. It might create some small stimulus in the chest, like activation of the pectorals, but only in an isometric sense. The contraction is being focused on the mechanistic load downward onto the shoulders rather than through the chest. That's where short-term memory and working memory really become more apparent in terms of motor skill learning. And when you're teaching somebody, those beginners often do not know what matters most, as prior stated. So the learner temporarily holds onto cues that are needed for the rep, and that's specifically like coach given instruction, like set the upper back, control the descent, press back and up. The problem is that working memory has that limited capacity, so if the coach gives too many cues at once, the performer may understand them individually but fail to actually coordinate them during that lift because the system, the cognitive system is overloaded. So the coach's job is to reduce noise and keep the cues simple enough that they can actually you can utilize and process the cues and actually like retain that information for later use, whether that be different reps or different movements that are similar, such as the incline versus the flat bench. With those repetitions and feedback, though, over time the movement becomes more stable and long-term memory. That matters because the performer is no longer trying to rebuild the entire performance from scratch at every rep. Instead, they are retrieving the learned pattern that has become more stable through practice. That's backed up by Budson et al. 2020. There's a big reason why movement starts to look smoother and more efficient as skill improves as you move from that cognitive stage to the associative stage to the autonomous stage, which leads into schema theory and generalized motor programs, or GMPs. Schema theory argues that performers do not store a separate motor program for every single variant of the same movement. Instead, they build a more generalized movement pattern that can be adapted to fit the task. That's Schmidt 1975 and Schrold and Lee 2003. The GMP contains invariant features, while other parts of the action are adjusted to parameters. That goes from, the invariant features would be you're taking the weight up, dropping it down, rising it up. The parameters would be the force applied, the slowness of the eccentric, the explosiveness of the concentric. The changes are those parameters. With the flat bench, both hands are fixed on one implement and the bench is horizontal, while the incline press, the angle changes and the line of force changes, and each arm has to stabilize independently if you're doing a dumbbell movement. It's backed up by Luke Zach et al. 2013, Rodriguez Rodeo et al. 2020. The anterior deltoid tends to contribute more as the incline increases, as I already said. Parameter changes applies to the same general pressing pattern, though. So it's easy. So the easiest way to separate parameters from invariant features is the invariant features are the broad parts of the press that stay stable. There's a static element. The overall sequence and general timing structure should generally be the same, while the parameters are things like the force, speed, range of motion can be a big one. Stabilization demand, that changes based off of if you're doing the flat bench on a Smith machine. The depth changes if you're doing, and range of motion changes if you're doing a partial rep, a lengthened partial where you're going down and you're only going up so far. You're not doing that lockout. The easiest, or the next part of the the lesson would be recall schema and recognition schema. The recall schema helps generate the movement before it happens. It uses past experience to decide how the press should be adjusted to the current situation. It's basically pattern recognition to a certain extent. You recognize that this behavior reflects, or the intended outcome based off of the situation is similar to previous ones. So before a flat bench rep, it helps determine things like the force, output, tempo, and grip. Before an incline press, it helps adjust for the new angle, greater stabilization demand, and different shoulder contributions. That is, the performer retrieving the general pressing solution and fitting it to that new task. The recognition schema is the evaluation side of that. It helps the performer judge whether the movement matched what was expected. So in a bench press, that means judging whether the bar path felt right, whether the weight was controlled, whether the dumbbells felt stable, or the barbell felt stable, whether the rep moved the way it should have. If your bench is set at too high an incline and you're not feeling it right, you're feeling it in your deltoids, that's where that recognition schema comes into play. That is why I think information processing and schema theory connects so well. Information processing explains how the learner handles the task mentally through attention, working memory, and long-term storage, whereas schema theory explains how the movement knowledge is being built and reused, meaning a generalized motor movement pattern that can be adapted rather than a collection of isolated skills. You're not just learning one fundamental movement or technique, you're learning how to apply it across variants. The practical takeaway from coaching is that early learning should focus on clear skill display, focusing on a small number of useful cues, and enough repetition that the athlete can build a stable movement solution in memory. Once that pattern is stable, the coach can change the parameters and use related variances, so the lifter learns the broader pressing solution rather than just the one rep. So overall, bench pressing is a strong example because it shows both the cognitive side and the motor side of learning. From the information processing side, the learner has to identify and filter the right information, hold the key cues in working memory, and eventually retrieve the movement from long-term memory. That's backed up again by Cohen 2014 inputs and al. 2020. From the schema theory side, the learner develops a generalized pressing pattern with stable invariant features, then changes parameters depending on whether the task is a flat barbell bench or an incline press. The task changes, but the core movement remains the same. From a coaching perspective, and how you would apply that would be simple. You take the less complex skill and focus on that to teach the basic movement pattern, and then as their proficiency increases, so too does the focus of your cues, targeting more specificity in movement, and that endows the learner more capability in terms of self-correction, in that, which is what you want at an autonomous stage, and builds them up throughout the associative stage. The cognitive stage is where you're building the GMP and establishing what will be the foundation for schema theory through information processing.